Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Firestone Files. I am Dr. Chris Firestone, and today we are discussing the question, what to do when your living conditions become unlivable. You know, some people are fortunate enough to grow up with the proverbial silver spoon in their mouth. They know hardship only as paying their taxes or, the car won't start or something trivial like that. And then they take care of this inconvenience. These aren't great problems to have, but you can live with them. Others aren't so fortunate. Perhaps you're living in a tough neighborhood where there's poverty or drugs or prostitution or bullying. Maybe these things are prominent in your neighborhood, and it creates a context that's so toxic that it wears on your mind, your body, and your soul. And it feels like such a weight that holds you back from pursuing the things in life that you're most passionate about. Perhaps ever finding those things that you're most passionate about. Well, today on the Firestone Files, we're going to talk about what to do when your life context is so bad that it needs a reset. When is it wise to stay the course? And when is it wise to leave? And how do you go about doing it? Well, the philosophy I want to start with today comes from a term that I invented along with a former student of mine who has now become a major podcaster in his own right, named Dr. Nathan Jacobs. He was believe it or not, an undergraduate student of mine in the late 1990s and early 2000s when I was teaching at Trinity College, just starting out. In fact, he was in my first class. Or I had 4 classes, I guess, every semester, sometimes more at Trinity. But he was in that first group of students in the first class that I taught. And I remember the course explicitly. It was an upper level course, believe it or not, called Contemporary Philosophy. I was a little overwhelmed teaching it as one of my first course preps. But I do remember developing this terminology with him over the course of the couple of years I had him as my undergraduate student. He has since gone on to do a master's degree and a PhD and make movies and write books and has his own podcast and all of that now. But back in the day, we developed this term, and it's called onto-contextology. I'll say that again, onto-contextology. We put a hyphen in between onto and contextology. And the term refers to an insight that we came to regarding the dual nature of human growth and development. In order to find something, you need to know or to consider 2 aspects of its existence. Its inherent nature, that is describing what it actually is, and that, for many people, that's as far as understanding a thing goes. You describe it. What color is it? What shape is it? How much does it weigh? What's it made out of? And lots of questions like that. And that's what I'm going to call its inherent nature. And then there is the environment in which it exists. Now, I first came to this insight years before I met Nathan, but I think Nathan and I put it into words back when he was an undergraduate student. I don't know that I'd write a paper on it today or anything, but maybe I would. I do think there's quite a bit of value here. And the reason I want to focus on it is that it's germane to this question about becoming all that you were meant to be, becoming all that you can be, and not allowing the environment in which you find yourself to define who you are. I first encountered this kind of principle when I was taking art lessons back in grade school in inner city Chicago. My mom used to take me to art lessons on Exchange Avenue down on the south side of Chicago. And I think it was Saturday mornings. We would go there and we would draw stuff or be taught how to draw stuff. Typically, it was still lifes. Something like fruit bowl on a table or, some of the classic stuff like that. Now, artists, I discovered even at that age, look at the world a little bit differently than, say, a lay person who's trying to draw the fruit basket on the table. You're trying to draw it realistically. You're trying to make it look like it really looks. You're trying to make it look like real fruit on a basket in a bowl on a table. And you're showing its imperfections, its changes in color, its proper shading and highlighting and so forth. Well, when I was like 9 or 10 years old in this art class, I would bring my sketchbook and crayons, and Nathan used to joke around because Nathan's a fine arts painter. He's trained in the Maryland Institute of Art and so forth. Before he came to Trinity, he used to joke around because I'd tell my crayon stories, and he'd say, "Crayons? Oh man, what kind of medium is that?" He had been used to working with higher level ingredients, you might say. But be that as it may, I remember learning a lesson when I was sketching things and trying to fill them out with shading and so forth with crayons. And one of the things I remember was that there's kind of two elements to drawing a thing. One was the sort of drawing and coloring, and the other was the environment around the thing. If you want to make an apple appear brighter, you can add color to the apple or maybe use a brighter red or something like that. That's for rookies, at least I came to find out in my art class. No, you want to make the apple brighter, then you make the background darker. If you darken the area around the object, it brings it into sharp relief, makes it appear brighter. Now, if there's lots of optical illusions like this, you can find them online or the internet or whatever, where changes in context can radically change the nature of a thing, or at least the appearance of the thing. So, in this sense, hear me out on this. An apple is what it is. It's an apple. That's what I'm going to call analytic logic, analytic thinking. And then an apple is what it isn't. In other words, you can define the apple or make it what it is by changing what it isn't. This is the difference in analytic logic and synthetic logic. I put a little bit of that up on the board behind me. In human terms, let me give you an example from athletics. If you want to be great at basketball, skilled, sharp, a super contributor to the team, you can do two things. You can train in practice. I'm going to call that one thing. That is to work on yourself. I had another buddy, John Hoyne, who loved playing basketball. We played a lot of basketball together. I got a lot of great stories of John Hoyne and I playing basketball, but he was able to increase his vertical, I think by 6 inches or so by building his own, what he called jumping machine in our apartment we had together back when I was in college. Or back when I was doing my master's degree, kind of transition between college and master's degree. He built this thing, and I was truly impressed, not only by his ability to build it, but his regular use of it and the dramatic effects that it had on his vertical, his leaping ability. So one thing you can do is to work on yourself. The other thing you can do is to go and play with the better players or the best players. Putting yourself in the context of basketball greatness can improve your skills in ways that mere training can't do. John and I, for example, used to march around to various playgrounds either in Chicago, Maywood, Bellwood, when we moved out there, where I went to high school. And then on into college and intramurals, we would go to where the better players were, both to test our skills, but also to improve our training and our skills. One of the best things to do is consider both of these things simultaneously. The analytic task of working on yourself, knowing what you need to do to get yourself in the kind of shape that would be a great basketball player's shape. And the other thing is to go where there's great basketball players, facilities, and so forth, which changes the context in which you find yourself. Train now because you have that in your control. And it's part of your everyday life if you're trying to become a basketball player. But get ready to move into a context that is more likely to achieve the desired results. Now, that's in some ways that's so common or obvious, but in other ways, not so much. And I guess I want to make the case that the two kind of work in tandem. You work on yourself at all times and all places and trying to build in rhythms in your life that achieve desired goals, but also go to where you will be, in a sense, blessed with people, opportunities, and contexts in which you can flourish in whatever it is that you want to do. Well, one of the stories I want to tell goes way back. I've already mentioned taking art classes on the south side of Chicago. I lived on the south side of Chicago for about 11 years before my family decided to move out to Bellwood, which is a western suburb of Chicago, and move out from the south side. And a variety of reasons for that. It became progressively more difficult for me to attend school there on the south side of Chicago, being the only Caucasian person, me and my brother, at the schools that we were at. We started at Bradwell Elementary School. Bradwell is a school on the south side of Chicago, somewhere around 80th Avenue, and maybe a little bit further, like 82nd Avenue. I can't remember exactly where it is. It's been a few years. But Bradwell Elementary was an all-black grade school, public school, and me and my brother were all-white kids going to Bradwell Elementary. It was pretty tough to go there. I was 6 years old. He was 8 years old, or something along those lines. I was effectively in first grade. He's in third grade, and he's like 2 years older than I am. 2.5 years older than I am. We'd be dropped off by our parents who were heading out to work. And that's when the bullying would begin. I'd walk behind my brother so that I would lessen the odds of being kicked or slapped or hit in the face by a flying object or some such thing. It just seemed like that kind of stuff just never ended. And here I was in first grade, didn't fully understand it, but I understood that I was under some kind of threat. And I remember walking behind my brother and holding his shirt, and just kind of trying to get into the school, get into class. The only clear memory I have of class was that the teachers would take attendance and that they would, in general, treat it like a study hall. Sometimes they would even leave the room. And when they left the room, that's when all hell would break loose in the classroom. I can remember being pounced on by students and so forth. It was just not a great context. And I think I was too naive and experienced to know any better. I just kind of thought this is the way life was. But I think my parents saw that I wasn't flourishing. My brother wasn't flourishing, and that there were things going wrong. I remember one day when the teacher left the room and locked the door, people started jumping on top of me and so forth. And I tried to scurry off into the back room because there's like a little escape room back there where you could sneak out into the hallway. And, they all followed me out there. The class was basically dismissed at that point. I don't even remember where we ended up going, but it was truly a mess. I could do a whole podcast on the problem with Chicago public school system when I grew up with it, which was many, many moons ago. Hopefully it's gotten better since then. But anyway, we got outside that classroom. We left the building, and oftentimes we never even go back to class. And those are some of my earliest experiences of school. My parents kind of used a little onto-contextology, if you will, synthetic reasoning, when they pulled me out of that context. They ended up putting me into a private Lutheran school called Emmanuel Lutheran School on the south side of Chicago, in kind of the other direction, but still in the same roughly in the same neighborhood. And again, this was another all-black school, except for us. However, they had one thing the public school system didn't have, and that was the paddle. And the paddle, I remember, was wrapped in foil. And to be honest, I got there kind of, I guess, midway in first grade, because my parents were seeing that the public school system was going nowhere, and I was getting traumatized by the whole thing. And so they put me in this private school, and I think I got that paddle quite a bit that first year, primarily because I had never been trained how to be a student. I just thought it was a free-for-all. I thought that was the way school went. Students would sneak books in the back of their pants to try to avoid it. Of course, the principal or the teacher would see those books. Oh, come on, young man, take that book out of there, and then whack. To be honest, it was not pleasant. It in a sense terrified me in some ways, but in another sense, it created a context in which I could finally learn. It was orderly. The classroom was bearable. Things were timely. We could actually read books, pick them up, put them down, have a normal classroom experience. And it made all the difference in the world to my learning and my growth. I began reading and writing and flourishing at Emmanuel Lutheran grade school. It was a contextual change that made such a huge difference in who I could become and who I felt like I could become. So I want to thank my mom and dad, and grandma and grandpa. At the time of shooting here, my dad's still alive, and my mom passed about 8 years ago. But they saw, the problem, and they took action. And this meant all the, this contextual change kind of who I was and what I might become. I stayed there at Emmanuel Lutheran from first grade to sixth grade. And my brother kind of went through, a grade ahead of me. And it was an oasis in my life at the time. The neighborhood on 79th and Saginaw, where I grew up, was pretty rough. My brother and I were harassed and bullied and beat up and antagonized on a regular basis, but we actually loved going to school. I had a really good friend who went to the public schools, and I saw through him what the real difference was. He was my same age. His name was Andre Cole, and we were just the best of friends. We played together all the time. We would play cars, Matchbox in the dirt behind my house, and we rode bikes and we played basketball together. And it was many years later when I reached out to Andre. I think it was in my mid-30s at the time, to see how he was doing, and I brought him out to my house. We had moved out not only to out of the city, but we'd moved out into the country by the time I was 30, in my early 30s. And Andre and I had two different life stories. He was caught up in a world down there that had made his life miserable. He looked 10 years older than me. He said, "Chris, you don't understand. I got into some things I shouldn't have." And, he complained about his life unraveling somewhat. I have not been able to contact him or reach him since then, so I'm not sure where he's at. Andre, if you see this podcast or hear of it, do reach out. I'd love to have you over for lunch again or dinner or whatever and just get caught up. But I think it would be a fascinating study of onto-contextology to see how the change of venue in my life and your staying in those conditions in your life, how they have changed and morphed our personal identities in ways that would be perhaps insightful. So, needless to say, we learned different things, and that whole experience on the South Side was really, really something. I remember walking into my kitchen one day because my parents, in the summertime, knew that we couldn't just walk the streets while they were at work, so they would put us in summer camp. And summer camp did not have the paddle associated with it. It was a little bit more like Bradwell Elementary than it was Emmanuel Lutheran, I remember walking into the kitchen one day, and my parents said, my brother was sitting at the kitchen table, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table, and it was a very somber mood. And they said, Chris, sit down. Have you been playing hooky? I said, huh? I was playing dumb. Hooky? What does that mean? I don't know what you're talking about. Are you not going to the day camp? My parents had put us in this camp, to get out of the streets, as it were. And we had taken to being dropped off and just skipping the camp and running away and doing our own thing. So we were wandering the streets. I remember hanging out at laundromats and dime stores, and they apparently the day camp, called us out on it, called the parents and said, hey, your kids haven't been showing up. In other words, that kind of accountability, that kind of context makes a difference. And having parents who are monitoring it makes a difference. That's the context side of your growth, your identity. You just don't work on raising kids. You sort of develop them by trying to put them into context where they can grow and become what they were meant to be. So one of the things that actually happened is, by the time I was in sixth grade or getting out of sixth grade, it became clear to my parents that the context that we were in was no longer livable. We were going into the upper, into junior high school at that point, and then on into high school, and our opportunities were limited in terms of the context in which we could flourish. And so they decided to move out to Bellwood, Illinois. And there, the schools were much better. They were mixed schools, which is, kind of a breath of fresh air for me. I wasn't the only Caucasian guy around. It was pretty much a healthy mixture of kind of cosmopolitan environment. I went to Roosevelt Junior High School and then Proviso West High School in Hillside, Illinois. And there I was able to stretch my wings a little bit. I definitely continued to play sports. I learned, that sports get harder and harder the higher you go up, and your commitment to them has to be there, or you need to find something else to do with yourself. So I learned to play chess while I was there. And I really had teachers who believed in what we could become, and they tried to train us accordingly. This was a revolution to me. A lot of my training before that was, strong discipline, opportunities to read and write and grow and so forth. And I'm very grateful for that at Emmanuel Lutheran School. But in a normal sort of developed high school, it really blossomed for us. And there's all sorts of stories of personal revolution in high school for me that I hope to tell someday. But really, I want to stick to the moral of the story, and that is a change of context. After I left Proviso West High School, I was better prepared for school, but just not fully prepared. There is a real value to having, good education early on in your life. And I had gone from bad to okay to good, but I never really saw excellent. And even though I was a pretty smart kid in high school, I was still kind of a C student because I didn't really know how to flourish as a student. And so I ended up spending some time in junior college to try to get my grades up. And then I tried to get into a good school, and I got into the University of Illinois at Urbana. And the reason I went there is because a number of my high school friends had gone there. I knew it was a really good school, and I wasn't ready for it for the first year or two of my college experience. But as I've kind of began to figure that out, I made the jump to the University of Illinois. And from that point, I got 2 bachelor's degrees, one in mathematics. That was I would call that my instrumental degree. I was good at math, but I really wasn't interested in math. But that's where I found philosophy as my first love, was at the University of Illinois. That's what sent me to a master's program at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. It was there that I found a place where I could study philosophy and faith in a sort of harmonious and a congenial context. And it's from that point that I was able to work on myself, work on my skills, and really blossom as a student, and decided to go overseas from there. And in my overseas journeys, I'll tell you about more later, but I ended up in Hong Kong and then pursuing a PhD in Scotland, and then coming full circle back to Chicago. All that to say was that going and changing my context and working towards new contexts meant all the difference in the world. You really, it's hard to express the importance of just doing it, of getting off your duff, changing your circumstances, and doing whatever's necessary to get out of the old and into the new. Now, as a Christian thinker, Christian philosopher, I do recognize that this is a kind of a, how do I put it, 2-step process. In Christian jargon, it would be salvation and formation. In other words, you need to change who you are. Because if the Christian worldview is right, we're all born into sin. We have a sinful nature. We may try to do good and so forth, but we can't help ourselves but go wayward in one way or another. And we need a new disposition. That old sinful one needs to die off. We need to take on a new one. We need to have a revolution in our person. And so I'm not discounting what I'm going to call the analytic side of the equation. That is understanding your own identity. Once you take stock of your own identity, you realize you're not the person that you want to be, and you need a change. And for the Christian, it's about believing in the person of Jesus Christ, killing off the old self, taking on the new, pursuing God because of a right relationship made possible by Christ's life, death, and resurrection. So all of that goes into this fundamental identity change that I'm talking about. And there's a chicken and the egg component to it, because if you've been raised a Christian, some of us, I was raised in the Methodist church and then was baptized as an infant and confirmed as a young adult. That identity was sort of built into me. I went a little bit wayward, you might say, in high school, and I reaffirmed my faith in my early 20s when I was a little bit more put together and realized how much I needed God and needed a change of disposition. Because if I'm left to my own devices, and creating my own context, as it were, it's all going to go sideways. And I kind of knew that, and I made that change. And for me, everything changed after that. So identity is important. Recognizing who you are before the living God, that is important. At the same time, a change of context is also important. I think as a Christian, I recognize the value of bringing the unbeliever into church, because the context itself exudes the gospel narrative. And you get into life rhythms that recognize that we need to repent, we need to change, we need to band together with other believers and grow together in order to have the kind of full life that we really would want in this world. So there's this interplay between identity and context. And that's what I was calling here at the outset in the sort of philosophical part of today's show, onto-contextology, recognizing that there are two components that make us who we are. The ontology, that is the identity, the essence of who you are, and that can change. And, this is a little different than the Greeks, because some of the Greeks, let's say like Plato, thought you were born with gold or silver or bronze in your soul, or maybe it's, tin. He didn't say that, but, you're born with a kind of, for Plato, you're born kind of predetermined to excellence or not. And in the Christian worldview, that's only half true. Yeah, we're born with certain innate talents and gifts, but we can have a revolution in our disposition when we take on the person of Christ, grafted into, as it were, the vine that is Christ. We can develop courage. We can develop perseverance. We can develop Christian character, and so forth. And so that I think is important to realize, that the onto, or the identity component, is indeed up for grabs, as it were, as we make life choices. And that can go good or bad. And if the Christian worldview is right, we have a tendency to be wayward, and we need the tendency to be good that is only found in the one who is good, the only one who is good, and that is Jesus Christ. And of course, Jesus died, lived, died, and rose again, and has left his spirit for the church. And now we access these things, this new identity, through the Holy Spirit and with fellow believers in the form of a church. That's the identity component of it. Once one becomes a Christian, or once one chooses to be a basketball player, there's an analogy here, or once one chooses, like I did, to become a scholar, you've got choices to make about your growth. You can, as it were, throw those seeds on, concrete or gravel. You can throw them onto, thorny areas, or you can throw them onto fertile soil. And I guess I'm advocating the fertile soil. There's a guy, I'm just remembering this now. There's a guy in seminary who had this strange statement that has always stuck with me, and I've forgotten his name, but he would say, I was a young man, I was dating, I was trying to find somebody who could go on life's journey with me, and he said, "Chris, you need to go to where the blessing is." I go to where the blessing is? What does that mean? You need to put yourself in places that increase the likelihood that you will find the significant other that you're seeking. Now, fortunately, I was already at Trinity. I ended up meeting my wife, who was an undergraduate at Trinity. I was doing a master's degree at Trinity. And so I'd already knew this principle, at least intuitively, but he put it into words: go to where the blessing is. And if you go to where the blessing is, it increases your likelihood of finding what you're looking for, both in yourself and in your relationships. And there's a principle there that I think is fundamentally important to our opening question. The opening question was, what to do when your living conditions become unlivable? Well, there is one piece of wisdom here that I think goes right to the heart of the matter. Go to where the blessing is. If it's unlivable, then go to a place that's livable. If you're living in squalor, if you're living in poverty, or you're living in places that are leading to temptations, you got to find a way to get yourself out of that. Now, as a Christian, I think step number one is to believe in the person of Jesus Christ, have a changed disposition. That empowers you to make changes. But I don't think it's, the sole bastion of Christianity. I think a non-Christian can change their context and live a better life. So it's a universal principle. It's not just a Christian one. The dual nature of the identity, or the onto-contextology, I think is a kind of distinctly Christian thing. But Anyway, at least it can be. But go make those changes, make an actual physical move. When I talk about synthetic logic, that's essentially what we're doing. When you're analyzing something, you're not moving, you're stationary, you're looking at something, and then you're unpacking its component parts. That's analytic thinking. You're thinking about yourself, you're working on yourself, you're working on your room, you're working on your environment, your immediate environment, and so forth. Synthetic logic is about mental movement, mental gymnastics almost, where you pick yourself up and move into a different context. And sometimes when you move, it jars new possibilities for your person, for who you are, who you might become. You see new things. I would have never known philosophy was a thing unless I got myself into the University of Illinois. I was at a junior college. I'd been really good at math. Didn't realize that when I took that philosophy of religion class with Dr. Robert McKim, that was like a watershed moment in my life, because I had picked up and moved and went and did something with myself. And I saw there a vision of who I could become. That then led me to the master's degree, where I saw a guy named Cliff Williams. And that's the guy I want to become. I want to become a philosopher at a college. Then I realized my master's degree wasn't going to be enough to accomplish that task. I needed a PhD. But I couldn't really stay in the States because my pedigree to that point wasn't going to put me in the kind of solid context I needed to be formed into the person I needed to become the person who I had envisioned myself to be. And so I went overseas and ended up doing a PhD in the United Kingdom and in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh. Again, got up, moved out, went to where the blessing was, and by God's grace became what he would have me to be. And, that has really made all the difference in my life, getting up and moving and getting out and doing. And so that I would submit to you is part of the takeaway here. In other words, there comes a time where packing up and moving is the wise thing to do. I know this is not easy. I'm not saying people who live in squalor, who are living in these tough conditions, are somehow at fault. I do think that sometimes we start looking inward. We have self-pity. We have a victim mentality. I've certainly been there in my own life at various times. And by God's grace, he's either brought somebody into my life or he has given me an insight that says, stand up, young man, get up and move and go where the blessing is. Part of maturing means preparing yourself to let go of the familiar, of the convenient, and to find a new environment, to put down some roots and to learn. Put yourself, there's another way in philosophy I like to put this, put yourself at the feet of people who can form you into what you were meant to become. I put myself at the feet of Robert McKim, of Harold O.J. Brown, of Dr. Kevin Van Hooser, of Dr. Nick Adams, was another supervisor of mine at the University of Edinburgh. And then I ended up coming over and getting a job, the job I'd always dreamed of at Trinity International University, sometimes called Trinity College. It made all the difference in the world that I went to where the blessing was, put myself at their feet, and became who I was meant to be. Now, notice the pattern here. Get your commitments in order. I guess that would be first and foremost. Sometimes we're struggling to understand the full nature of our commitments. I was a young Christian, but I didn't have kind of all the pieces together. In some ways I still don't, but I feel like I have a better grasp on my commitments now. And then change your context so that you can grow and fill out those things you don't fully understand and become, a little bit more put together, if you will. in your commitments, in your faith. And then go to where the blessing is. And when you get there, be flexible. It's gonna it's gonna be a change. But you need to be flexible. You need to be teachable. Sometimes we use the word meek. You need to be teachable. You need to be resilient. That is, you're going to get knocked down a few times in process, because anytime you make a move, you go to a different culture, a different context, you learn by trial and error. And sometimes it's more error than success. But you tend not to make the same mistake twice. You tend to learn and grow and become, in a sense, resilient through that process. And the last point I want to make is be a finisher. There's a couple principles here. I may talk about these more later on, but there's two things that I learned in my PhD sort of quest. And that is what I would call the principle of initiation and the principle of culmination. The principle of initiation is all about starting. It's all about taking that first step. I think Confucius says the journey of a 1,000 miles begins with one step, something like that. Nothing more important than realizing where you want to go and taking the initial step. In business, they call that going 0 to 1. Some of the best startups never kind of materialize because they can't take the first step. And I would submit to you, if you find yourself in doldrums, poverty, in an environment that is not healthy for you, then you need to take maybe childlike steps to initiate a change. And when you initiate that kind of change, you can expect that you will be formed and reformed in the process. And so this principle of initiation is super important. You need to get started. You need to walk out the door, and you need to walk into a new door. And that initiates a new experience. Coupled with the principle of initiation, I would suggest to you, is the principle of culmination. Let's call it finishing. Try not to start anything that you don't plan to finish. Now, when you're younger in particular, sometimes even when you're older, you make false starts. Like you get in a little bit over your head, and the best thing to do is go backwards and reboot. Don't deny that. I'm particularly a person who has made mistakes in this regard and realized it pretty quickly. It's kind of like in the Bible where it talks about don't stay in debt, but pay your debtor off as quickly as possible. This is the same thing when you make mistakes in initiation. If you take that first step and can't sleep that night, or there's something wrong with it, step backwards and get out of it. There's usually, it's like buying an airplane ticket, at least here in the United States, at the time of filming. You got 24 hours to pull your ticket back before you're obligated to pay the price for it and go or not use the ticket. Similarly, initiate well. Use your best judgment, assess the situation, and take a step of faith and go. And I got 1,000 stories I could tell you about how that very act meant all the difference in the world to me. The principle that is coupled with that is culmination. Always finish what you start. There's a lot of different reasons why this is important. Culmination is the way of putting the money in the bank, right? You may accrue interest, but until you actually take it and bank it, it just sort of sits out there. You need to, in the principle of culmination, it's like when you start a degree, an undergraduate degree. You either need to pull the Band-Aid off and get out of it and go become a plumber, or you need to finish what you start. And there's great value in being someone who follows through. So you get on a job site. Let's say you are a plumber. You get on a job site and you realize, man, there's more to this than I thought. Don't be that person that leaves a mess, pulls out, and never shows up again. You said that you were going to fix that thing. Fix it. get to the finish line. Similarly, you started your degree, finish that degree. Do what's necessary to get it done. If you're flourishing, you can take your time. If you're not flourishing, get it done. Or I suppose you can move to a different context, but at some point, you're going to need to finish, culminate what you initiated. And that actually puts it on your CV, your curriculum vitae, sometimes called a resume. And you have that on your resume, you have now banked it, as it were. And banking stuff means you finished, you culminated, you said you were going to start something and you finished it. And that builds rapport with people, that builds reputation, and that builds formation in your person that you're not just a starter, you're a finisher. And that's true in the Christian life, by the way. My goodness, we get knocked down. You know, I like C.S. Lewis. He said, if you ever tried being, if you think being good was easy or is easy, then you never tried. In other words, you stepped out in faith. You know, you may get knocked down. You may find yourself caught in sin. You may find yourself making a stupid mistake. You knock down, you get back up, and you finish the race. And you achieve the prize. And that is what culmination is all about. So you may begin with an impoverished spirit, but you develop into a God-honoring power person for the kingdom ends when you initiate well and you culminate what you've initiated. Knowing who you are and becoming who you were meant to be is of the utmost importance to all of us. You notice that this whole process I'm talking about, onto-contextology, is the answer to one of the biggest questions of philosophy. Who am I? Who am I is one of the, if you're going to take a top 5 question in philosophy, that one is who am I is right up there. And you're only going to know who you are if you have identity change. In other words, you know yourself in the presence of the living God. And then you form yourself in mission for kingdom ends by changing your context and going, making disciples of all nations, as it says in Matthew 28. And that's the final answer. And it's what we're all looking for in philosophy, in the answer to the question, who am I? A lot of us in this world will go around asking that question for the rest of our lives and just kind of leaving it open-ended. And yet the answer is right before us. So anyway, that's really all I have to say today on that question. When your living conditions become unlivable, make a change. You can do this. You can step out. And it makes all the difference in the world. I'm going to have more to say. There's a kind of a tangential question here about working hard or hard work. I'll talk about that one in another podcast. But I think that but those kinds of contextual changes make all the difference in the world. All right. Well, that's it for now. All the best to you, blessings, and I'll see you next time on the Firestone Files. Thanks for stopping by to spend some time with me here on the Firestone Files. I hope today's reflections offered you some new insights and perspective on life. If you enjoyed the episode or found it valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Or what would you like to hear more about in future episodes? Drop a comment below or send in your suggestions to the email in the description. Your input helps shape where we go next. This has been Dr. Chris Firestone. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, the kingdom journey is always best with your friends. Further up and further in. Bye for now.